Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on Native Americans and the Underground Railroad in the Midwest. My name is Amanda Pollack. I am the Visual Information Specialist for the Network to Freedom, and you're going to meet our excellent panel of speakers in just a few minutes. Just as a quick introduction to this webinar, we're going to be focusing on the Shawnee, Wyandot, and their allies in the Ohio country. And this panel is going to explore the cooperation of Native Americans, African Americans, whites, and mixed-raced individuals who assisted and provided sanctuary to enslaved persons escaping bondage in the South. We're just going to go ahead and kick it off. Just a couple of housekeeping bits. This webinar is currently being recorded. So just so you're aware, we are recording this. We will be putting this webinar online as we go through this process. If anybody has a question that you'd like to ask our presenters that you think of either during the presentation or after the presentation, or you'd like to leave a comment for our presenters, you're more than welcome to do so just by opening the chat. You should see a chat box on the bottom right-hand corner. Of course, we are going to be talking about some challenging subjects today, so we do just ask that whatever you do write in the chat box be respectful and thoughtful of everybody that is present today in this webinar. Without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to the one and only Roy Finkenbine. He is going to be our first presenter for this morning's conversation, and we will go from there. So thank you all for coming. Let's go ahead and get started. So Roy, I just sent you a request to unmute, and the rest of us should all be muted.
Hello and welcome. I'm Roy Finkenbine. I'm a professor of history and director of the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Detroit Mercy and a member of the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. And we are thrilled to be co-hosting with the Network to Freedom this webinar today. I'm going to be talking about a phenomenon known as Black Indians through the life and family of a revolution era freedom seeker named Caesar. On or about October 1st, 1774, an enslaved Virginian named Caesar slipped away from the site of his bondage in the Piedmont, ascended and crossed the Appalachian Mountains, likely descended the Kanawha River to the Ohio, and has made its way to the Shawnee villages on the lower Scioto River in the Ohio country, where he sought sanctuary. While white American colonists moved inexorably towards fighting for their collective independence from the British, Caesar seized his own personal freedom. Caesar was one of perhaps hundreds of slaves in Virginia and Maryland who made their way to Native American villages in the Ohio country during the era of the American Revolution. Even before the Shawnees relocated there in the mid-18th century, they had been in the habit of welcoming fugitive Africans from southern farms and plantations. A Shawnee village named King Opessa's Town, near what is now Cumberland, Maryland, offered refuge to those who fled from their enslavers. Once beyond the mountains, the Shawnees continued to offer sanctuary to escaping freedom seekers. Lower Shawnee Town, which existed from 1748 to 1756 at the confluence of the Ohio and Scioto rivers, counted several Africans among its residents. As the American Revolution neared, freedom seekers from Virginia and Maryland could be found in the 7 Shawnee villages on the lower Scioto, as well as the 6 Shawnee villages and other Delaware villages on the Muskingum River in the Ohio country. So Caesar's experience wasn't entirely unique. We know more about Caesar's biography than most of these freedom seekers who sought sanctuary in the Ohio country, thanks to the work of Shawnee genealogists and a runaway slave advertisement posted in the Virginia Gazette by his enslaver. Born about 1740 in Cumberland County in the Virginia Piedmont, his parentage reflected the triracial heritage of colonial America. His father, an African, had been enslaved and transported across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage. His mother was a Métis slave from Bermuda of mixed Spanish and Shawnee descent. The property of David Copeland of Cumberland County during his childhood and youth, Caesar was owned at the time of his escape by Robert Lawson of Prince Edward Courthouse, Virginia, a man of some local importance. Lawson described him in his 1774 runaway slave advertisement as, quote, about 5 feet 8 or 9 inches high and well made. One must surmise that his mother's partial Shawnee ancestry played a role in his decision to set out for the Ohio country. In late 1774, not long after reaching the Shawnee villages on the Scioto, Caesar was adopted into the tribe. While he left no record of this ritual, it likely approximated this description by historian John MacFarrager. Quote, typically the induction ceremony included ceremonial washings that symbolized an end to old roles, as well as body painting, hair plucking, and dressing to mark the assumption of new identities. As the Shawnees informed British colonists about white and black adoptees, quote, they have been all tied to us by adoption, and we will always look upon them as our relations. Also in late 1774, Caesar met and married Sally, a 14-year-old Metis girl of mixed Shawnee and white racial heritage. Her mother, a white woman, possibly a captive, had earlier been adopted into the tribe. Sally belonged to the Kishpiko division, the warrior clan within the Shawnees. Together, Caesar and Sally produced several children over the next 3 decades. In 1775, Sally bore their first son, also named Caesar. 2 years later, another child was born. In 1780 and 1785, respectively, 2 more sons were born, named Sally's white son and Sally's black son in all historical records because of their difference in skin color. These 2 are the ones of Sally and Caesar's children who left the greatest mark in the historical record. Between 1786 and 1805, other children were born to the Union. Adopted and married into the Kishpiko division, the warrior clan of the Shawnee, Caesar fought with other warriors to try to hold on to the Ohio country. According to Shawnee genealogists, he fought in Revolution-era conflicts at Point Pleasant on the Upper Ohio, 1775 to 1778, at the Siege of Boonesboro, 1778, and the Battle of Blue Lick, 1782 in Kentucky, and Crawford's defeat, also in 1782, in the Sandusky River Valley in northern Ohio. From 1788 through 1792, he was involved in raids on white settlements throughout the Ohio River Valley. Meanwhile, these conflicts dislodged his family and his adopted people. In 1777, many Shawnees, including Caesar and Sally, abandoned their homes in the Scioto and moved northwestward to the Great Miami, the Little Miami, and the Mad Rivers, where they established new villages. In 1786, Colonel Benjamin Logan and his Kentucky militia turned many of these villages into smoldering ruins. If I can add as an aside, my mother grew up in Logan County, where much of this occurred, Logan County, Ohio. And it is my regret to state that I have relatives who are graduates of Benjamin Logan High School, named after this militia leader who burned these Shawnee villages. And if I can plant a seed to anyone out there, it would be thrilling to see a reevaluation of the naming of this and so many other sites in that area. About 1,000 Shawnees, including Caesar and Sally, after this burning, built new towns in the St. Mary's and Maumee rivers about 100 miles to the north. Caesar became attracted then to the efforts of Shawnee leader Blue Jacket to construct a pan-Indian confederacy to resist white encroachment in the Old Northwest. He likely fought in Native American victories known as Harmar's Defeat, 1790, St. Clair's defeat, 1791, in northwestern Ohio, which demoralized the early American army and persuaded many Indians that they could hold on to control of the Ohio country. Caesar also appears to have been a warrior in the decisive and unfortunate Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, which followed. This was on the Maumee, and Native Americans were thoroughly routed by the U.S. Army, and their villages and cornfields burned. In the resulting Treaty of Greenville, 1795, that resulted from the defeat, Native Americans were forced to sign away claims to the southern and eastern two-thirds of Ohio. After the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Greenville, many Shawnee warriors determined to stop fighting and to migrate westward. Caesar was one of them. In 1812, he and Sally joined some 1,200 Shawnees who left the Ohio country after 1790 for fertile farmland along Apple Creek, just north of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. Many of these were Kishpiko. There they continued to speak their indigenous language, hunt and farm, gather nuts and roots, process animal skins, and celebrate Shawnee rituals. Even so, their cabins resembled those of their white neighbors. The presence of white neighbors brought growing conflict again. Historian Stephen Warren reports that, quote, between 1811 and 1814, Apple Creek Shawnees reported the loss of over 65 hogs, 49 cattle, and 48 horses. Furthermore, their houses were frequently ransacked, and there was occasional white violence against the Shawnees themselves. It must have been a troubling time for Caesar and Sally, who apparently died at Apple Creek during the decade that followed. Unlike their parents, Sally's white son and Sally's black son chose to remain in the Old Northwest and to fight to hold on to the land. By 1811, they had joined Shawnee brothers Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, also known as the Prophet, in their effort to construct a pan-Indian confederacy at Prophetstown on the Wabash River in central Indiana. It appears that they were among 5,000 to 8,000 warriors defeated by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe, which led to the burning of Prophetstown. They then fought with Tecumseh and the British in at least 6 battles during the War of 1812, including the Battle of the Thames in 1813, in which Tecumseh was killed. Once the conflict ended, they and their families settled in Upper Canada, contemporary Ontario, beyond the reach of the Americans, but far from their beloved Ohio country. About a decade after the War of 1812, probably in 1825, Sally's black son returned to the Ohio country, eventually settling on the Shawnee and Seneca Reservation at Lewistown. But this too was to be short-lived. Implementation of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 soon cleared most Shawnee out of the Ohio country. In July 1831, the Shawnee and Seneca living at Lewistown were pressured to sign a treaty ceding their reservation in exchange for some 60,000 acres in northeastern Oklahoma. Political machinations, however, delayed the journey westward until September 1832. Eventually, some 250 Shawnee and Seneca from Lewistown made their way across Ohio, Indiana, Illinois in a lengthy exodus. The young walked, the aged and infirm rode on horses or in wagons, accompanied by government agents. One of these agents, Daniel Donahue, recorded the name of Sally's black son as one of the migrants. And in a tip of the hat to the importance of historical serendipity, I initially encountered this name in Donahue's journal in visiting a museum exhibit in 2017 down near Cincinnati called Exiled, that was on the Wyandot and Shawnee removal from Ohio during the 1830s and early 1840s. And in the exhibit, Open in one of the display cases was Donohue's ledger of the migrants, open to the page that displayed Sally's black son. Sometimes historical serendipity is a historian's best friend. The migrants crossed the Mississippi River at Kaskaskia, Illinois, a task which took 2 days and 20 crossings to accomplish. They then passed through southern Missouri on the way to Oklahoma, frequently harassed by white settlers along the way. The trip took the better part of 3 months. Although many babies were born along the way, deaths from cold and exposure, dysentery, consumption, and cholera brought their numbers down to 220 by the time they arrived. And indeed, while we think of the Trail of Tears as something usually experienced by Southern Indians heading westward, Sally's black son and his fellow Shawnee and Seneca experienced their own Trail of Tears. Caesar and his children are early examples from the Indian country of the Old Northwest of what historian William Loren Katz labels Black Indians in his book of the same name. Katz defines Black Indians as people of dual African and Native American ancestry, or, quote, Black people who have lived for some time with Native Americans. Caesar and his children represent both parts of this definition. Furthermore, Caesar illustrates the significant number of freedom seekers who found sanctuary in Native American villages from 1619 until the end of the Civil War. Collectively, this family highlights the important but frequently hidden role of Native Americans in the Underground Railroad in the Midwest by allowing their villages to become places of refuge. Today, Caesar's name continues to exist on the Ohio landscape at Caesar's Creek, a waterway in the southwestern part of the state. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Roy. Thank you so much for sharing that story about Caesar. So we are just having a little bit of a technical issue. So if you all could just be a little bit patient with me while I just try and get our next speaker.
Hello, can you hear me, Amanda?
I can. Did I guess right on the first one? This is exciting. Okay.
Yeah.
So in that case, I'm going to share my screen in just a second. On the phone is Diane Miller, who is going to be your next speaker. So thank you, Diane, and away you go.
Thank you. And thank all of you for sharing some time with us today. I'm sorry that I'm by phone here because WebEx just kept freezing on my computer. So Amanda's going to run the PowerPoint while I talk about this. So the title of this presentation is called In Union There is Strength, Wyandot, Shawnee, and African American Resistance to Slavery. November 24th, 2020, Network to Freedom webinar. Okay, next slide. So there were Native and African American connections almost from the start of the colonial period. European colonial societies and the American nation were inextricably linked to the histories of Native and African Americans through dual policies that they ran of removal and genocide of Native peoples and slavery of Africans. These policies were meant to separate and control minority populations. And these two populations had different vulnerabilities. Tribes, as domestic dependent nations after the Revolution, were protected from enslavement, but they lost their territory. African Americans were vulnerable to enslavement. And so these twin policies had the effect of sometimes making tribes and enslaved African Americans as allies and sometimes as oppositional to each other. So I want to define what I mean by the Underground Railroad. The Network to Freedom calls this the resistance to enslavement through escape and flight, and we include freedom seekers at the center of the story and those who assisted them in their efforts to escape enslavement. It began in the earliest colonial period. They didn't wait until 1830 when railroads became common to use that terminology. And in the early colonial period, enslaved Africans sought refuge with the tribes. We have a map there of Underground Railroad routes that has been expanded through the stories coming to us from all of the communities around the country. Next slide, Amanda. So Colonial Refuges, Roy mentioned this, but I was reading in the General Assembly languages in records in Maryland and some of the colonial records in Virginia, and the colonial governments had a real problem, and they were really concerned because enslaved people kept escaping and joining the native tribes. So the Maryland General Assembly in 1722 records that as the Shawnees at this time do and protect them under the pretense of their having set such slaves free, this gentleman we look upon as a matter of great importance. The place that they are talking about was King Opessa's town that Roy mentioned, which is located at the confluence of the north and south branches of the Potomac River near Columbia, Maryland. And we have a picture of a marker of that site. So as a nation expanded and the frontier kind of moves west, many of the tribes get pushed, the northern tribes kind of get pushed into the Ohio River Valley. And so I have a map, next slide, Amanda. A map of the Indian trails and the Underground Railroad routes in Ohio, because what I think is really interesting is that if you could actually look at these laying over top of each other, you'll see that they have some very similar routes, and you can follow some of the lines all the way through. I've highlighted in yellow a line from Upper Sandusky to where the Wyandot Grand Reserve was to Lake Erie. That route is on Wilbur Siebert's Underground Railroad map, and it's also on the Archaeological Atlas of Ohio map of Indian routes. Next slide. So by 1815, Ohio had been created as a state, but it was still fairly sparsely settled. There was a lot of conflict between the settlers and the tribes. And after the War of 1812, there was after the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Treaty of Greenville, the native tribes ceded much of their territory in southern Ohio and were somewhat pushed up to the northern part of Ohio. And so they were a lot in the northern and western part of the state, which was not well populated by settlers. And a lot of that territory was pretty difficult to pass through because of the Black Swamp. And this area was a space where many freedom seekers that were coming out of Kentucky would be encounter native tribes and would be helped by native tribes. Famously, Josiah Henson, who is the basis of the character Uncle Tom in Uncle Tom's Cabin, gives in his narrative a discussion of encountering the tribes there. Okay, so next slide, Amanda. Hopefully you're on Negro Town. So during this period, there developed in the Wyandot Reservation an area called Negro Town where African-American families lived. There were some captives, African captives that had been adopted into the tribe, Sam Wells, Jonathan Pointer, who became an interpreter, and these people were settled in the area of Negro Town. Importantly, that town is there when John Stewart comes to the tribe in 1816. He's an African-American missionary. In 1819, he was licensed by the Methodist Episcopal Church to preach, and in August of 1819, the Methodist Episcopal Church established the first formal mission to the Wyandot. And we have a picture of a historic marker that talks about the Wyandot Indian Mission as the first Methodist mission in America overall. And this was a really important thing in this history. Stewart preached to the Wyandot, had a little trouble getting converts at first, but was able to eventually start getting converts. Jonathan Pointer, who was living in Negro Town, was a translator for him. The importance of Stewart being in amongst the Wyandot is that Stewart's siblings and nephews were major Underground Railroad conductors in an area in southeast Ohio called Poke Patch. Stewart died in 1823, and he's buried at the Mission Church in Upper Sandusky. We have a picture of a little plaque for him. And it's not completely clear to me exactly the role that Stewart played and whether he himself was involved in assisting freedom seekers coming through this area, but his relatives being highly involved in Poke Patch, and I believe some of them settling in Cass County, Michigan, really illustrates kind of this connection through Ohio territory. And as Roy mentioned, next slide, Amanda, in 1826, the Shawnees left Ohio. They arrived in Kansas in 1828. The Wyandot were the last tribe to remove to Kansas in 1843. Some of the Negro Town residents, such as Jonathan Pointer, remained in Ohio, fearing the inability of the tribe to ensure their safety while they were traveling through slave states on the way to Kansas. Next slide. So the U.S. in the 1840s had started adding huge chunks of territory. Actually, the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and territories gained from Mexico. And one of the most contentious political discussions of the time was what should be the status of slavery in these territories. And so next slide, the question revolves around, as we add this new territory, is freedom assumed and slavery needs to be enacted specifically by state laws? Or is slavery assumed and the federal government is bound to protect the property rights of the slaveholders? Whichever way you look at it, what everyone agrees on is whatever the character of the territory is when it's settled, either slave or free, it's widely understood that the state will follow that characterization. So there's an intense desire to have this territory settled as free territory or as slave territory. So this sets up the tribes as they're moved into these territories. Despite the Missouri Compromise banning slavery north of the 3630 latitude, missionaries and Indian agents that worked with the tribes in these territories introduced slavery. The Shawnees had missionaries from the Methodist, Episcopal, and Baptist and Quaker denominations. And Shawnee Methodist Episcopal missionary Thomas Johnson established a manual training school that many tribes sent their children to, and he used enslaved labor. He was kind of a notorious enslaver. But at the same time, among the Shawnee, you have Quaker missionary Henry Harvey, who was with them in Ohio as well as in Kansas, and further moved west in Kansas and was an Underground Railroad operative. So you have these competing forces tugging at the tribe. And there's a great quote that I found from an Indian agent that says, "We intend to have this country for slavery, peacefully if we can, but if not peacefully, we will have it anyway." So the missionaries, the Indian agents were all trying to influence slavery to be introduced into the territory. So next slide should be on the 1840s border war. There's a picture of Lucy Bigelow Armstrong, who married John McIntyre Armstrong, that was a member of the tribe. She and John McIntyre were really staunch abolitionists and supporters of the Underground Railroad. She's quoted later as saying, "We had our border ruffian war before you had yours," because in the 1840s, long before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the issue of slavery was tearing apart the tribes. There's even a petition I found that in 1848, a Wyandot petition to Congress to uphold the Missouri Compromise, because they made the case that territory was already free ought to remain free. But in the 1840s, slavery was tearing apart the whole country. So the Methodist Episcopal Church actually divided in 1843 with the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church that allowed slaveholding, and the Northern, or just regular Methodist Episcopal Church that was abolitionist. The Indian missionaries were assigned to the Methodist Episcopal Church South in 1843, and the abolitionist missionaries that had been with the tribe since Ohio were replaced by pro-slavery missionaries. And this caused a lot of problems within the tribe. The tribe split over slavery. Pro and anti-slavery congregations developed. There was church burnings and violence. But in the end, Wyandot and Shawnee tribal leaders adopted slavery. Most of the tribal members seemed to remain anti-slavery. So as Bleeding Kansas comes along and the northern and southern parts of the U.S. are trying to send their settlers there to Kansas to claim that territory, the Wyandots, understanding the development pressure, moved to have the territory organized, and there becomes a kind of a divide over whether the tribal members should become U.S. citizens and receive individual plots of land so that they could perhaps benefit from land speculation. And in 1855, there was a treaty where individuals had the right to claim U.S. citizenship in exchange for ceding land, and they were granted land and severalty. Some tribal members never did do that and ended up going to Oklahoma. So next slide. So I'm back to Reverend Thomas Johnson, who was the Shawnee Methodist Episcopal missionary. He became a leader in the pro-slavery movement following Kansas-Nebraska Act. He used the Shawnee Manual Labor School as the headquarters for the pro-slavery forces. The Shawnee got really tired of this, and they petitioned for a new missionary. They outlined all kinds of financial improprieties by Johnson and his advocacy of slavery as against their values. So next slide. So after this period, or in the midst of this period, in 1857, Quindaro was established, and this was established on tribal land. It was a free state port on the Missouri River and a crossing for freedom seekers. The fastest way to travel out to Kansas was using the Missouri River. So Nancy Quindaro Brown and Abelard Guthrie were two of the town founders. Nancy was a cousin to the Wyandot chief and abolitionist George I. Clark. Abelard was cousin to Iowa Underground Railroad figure Reverend John Todd of Tabor. And we've got some pictures of the two of them there. So for the next slide about Quindaro, this was an active Underground Railroad town. It was connected with the active towns of Lawrence and Topeka. In 1858, in addition to the Methodist Episcopal Church that was there, the Congregational Church organized with Underground Railroad operatives, SD Stores, and Reverend Cordley from Lawrence. The Congregational Church, almost everywhere you find it, is involved with the Underground Railroad. There was a Quindaro Library Association that held abolitionist lectures and with speakers on the Underground Railroad. The Quindaro Literary Association was a vibrant intellectual community, and they met at a place that they called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which they claimed was dedicated to emancipation without proclamation, and appears to be a place where some of their Underground Railroad activity was carried on or planned from. Serena Nichols, who was the assistant editor of the Chindawan newspaper, recounted a story that she hid Caroline, a freedom seeker, in her cistern while 14 slave catchers searched the town, and the town did not give up Caroline. So the essence of all of this, though, is in the end, slavery never gained a strong foothold in Kansas, and the resistance by the tribes really contributed to the success of the Free State movement. And that's it. I have a slide with my contact information for anybody that might want that, and I will turn it back to Amanda and Holly and Kristen.
Alrighty, awesome. Thank you, Diane. So now I'm going to turn you all over to Holly and Kristen Zane. They were not advertised on the original notice, but they're our special guests today. I'll let them introduce themselves for you all. Holly and Kristen, I just requested you all to unmute. Once I can see that you're unmuted, I will turn it over to you.
Hello, I'm Holly Zane. I'm Associate Director of Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area in Kansas and Missouri, but I'm also an enrolled member of the Wyandot Nation of Kansas. I'm called the Whetsel Resatata, which means she who extends her paw. This is my sister, Kristen Zane.
And my Wyandot name is Yaron Away, which means floating voice.
Just to give you some background, we're probably the most traveled tribe in the United States. We originally are from the area of Ontario. You might know us as Wyandots or Huron, but our original name is Wyandot, which means people of the peninsula. We had our reservation in Detroit by the 1700s, and within about 20 years of that, another group that was more affiliated with the British moved into Ohio. We had several villages in Ohio, but our main village was in the area that is now known as Upper Sandusky, Ohio. It was known by the early 1800s as Crane Town, named after our great-great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Tarhee, who was known as the Crane because he was 6'4" and all legs at a time where most men were 5'4". Our ancestor, our white ancestor, is Isaac Zane, who was captured as a 9-year-old boy and became an adoptee of the Wyandot tribe and eventually married the Chief Tarhee's daughter, Myra. So on our Zane side, we're Quakers, believing in the equality of women and people of all racial, ethnic backgrounds. One of the reasons why we came from England to the United States, and our ancestor was original founder of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they also founded what is now considered Wheeling, West Virginia, which is where Fort Henry, the last battle of the American Revolution, was fought in 1785. Our reservation in Upper Sandusky, as Diane Miller was indicating, the northern portion of our reservation was called Negrotown. To this day, there's a road that is still called Negrotown Road. There is a African-American church that dates back at least to the early 1800s that's there. minister, as Diane was saying, was John Stewart, who was African-American freedman, and a traditionalist in our tribe was John Pointer. He was our interpreter. He was an escaped slave from Virginia, and he was adopted as a son by our great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Chief Tarhee. We, to this day, are traditionalists. We engage in traditional ceremonies with the Seneca Cayuga that are in Grove, Oklahoma, and they are the Seneca Cayuga tribe that was located just northeast of Sandusky, Ohio, Upper Sandusky, Ohio, before we were removed. During the Indian Removal Act, we resisted removal from Ohio 4 times. We were forcibly removed to abandon our homes, our farms, our businesses, and come to Kansas in 1843. And the land we were promised was not available, so we ended up buying with our own money land from the Delaware after having lost a third of our tribe, having to camp out in the winter and in flooded areas in Kansas. Believe it or not, even though some of the African-American members of our tribe and who were on our reservation, our friends, our neighbors, our family, remained in Ohio, a good number of them did go south to Kansas City when we were removed. The Kansas City Star and other newspapers talk about the number of African Americans that were walking through the town when we arrived. What was interesting about Indian trust land is that it is illegal to have slavery on trust land on Indian country. Also, the Fugitive Slave Act had no jurisdiction on that land, which means under the Fugitive Slave Act, if you're familiar with it, if you interfered with a snatcher, someone from the South coming to take an escaped slave, you could be imprisoned. You could also, under the Fugitive Slave Act, be imprisoned for not helping someone trying to recover their quote unquote property, which is an escaped slave. Well, in Indian country, it had no jurisdiction. And Diane Miller mentioned Lucy Armstrong. Lucy petitioned several times when the few pro-slavery members of her tribe tried to bring slaves on our reservation. She petitioned to have them removed. And it is true that Methodist ministers that were assigned to her tribe that we tried to have removed that were pro-slavery, not just Reverend Johnson, but if you remember Shivington, who was responsible for the worst Native American massacre in Colorado, the Mine Creek Massacre, he was a minister assigned to the Wyandots in Kansas who we opposed. He stole from us. He was pro-slavery. He was a bad individual, and yet he was assigned to us. In Kansas, not only did we establish the first 3 free schools in Kansas, we allowed people of color to be at those schools. It was our teacher, who was John Armstrong, was fluent in French, in Greek, in Latin, and all the different native languages too. We also allowed people of color to vote in our elections. In the Treaty of 1855, which Diane Miller alluded to, under federal law, broke up our reservation into individual allotment, which at that time it meant that the land was no longer considered Indian country. By 1857, the individual Wyandots got their land parcels, and that really endangered African Americans living on our reservation. The fact that the Fugitive Slave Act did have jurisdiction then on individual land, and also it was not illegal on individual land in Kansas to have slaves. So it really behooved Wyandots to figure out a way to protect their African American friends and neighbors and others that they didn't know that were enslaved and were trying to escape. And that's the idea for Quindaro. 13 Wyandots put up their allotments to start Quindaro, including Kristen's and my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother, Ebenezer O. Zane Sr., who was a Wyandot, and Rebecca Zane, who was a Delaware. And Ebenezer opened up the Wyandot House Hotel in Quindaro. At different times during the Civil War, Quindaro was the only free port in Kansas, and it's the largest abolitionist site in the United States during the Civil War. Ebenezer's Wyandotte House Hotel, he would safeguard escapes of slavery from Missouri, both in his hotel and also in the cistern and back. He would get tribal members to bring him through Indian trails through our prior reservations in Ohio and Michigan up to Canada. There was an issue where he was identified as an abolitionist, and because the general who was supposed to be protecting Quindaro was a pro-slavery, he tried to ruin the buildings by putting livestock in them, tearing off doors and windows to try to burn them, forcing the women into Kansas City to abandon some of the buildings while the men were fighting in both white, Indian, and the first colored unit of Kansas, which is the first colored unit in the United States. Wyandots, Delaware, and Sac and Fox all fought. They were Native, not necessarily African American, fought in the first colored and the second colored units of Kansas. But they captured Ebenezer O. Zane, put a bond on him, put him in Fort Leavenworth because he was an abolitionist, and their thinking was that abolitionists caused damage. He was forced to sell basically everything he owned, the Wyandot House Hotel, other than the home that he lived in, borrowed money from family. I think $1,000 bond we figured out at that time would be about $30,000 nowadays. And he was also arrested because near where his home was in Quindaro, separate from where the Wyandotte House Hotel was, something called the 6 Miles Tavern. And that's where the snatchers who would come over from Missouri and the pro-slavery folks would come and have some ale and plan their escapades to take back both escaped slaves and freemen who should not be taken back and taken into slavery. They had planned among the abolitionists, including Ebenezer O., to burn the 6 Mile Tavern and to waylay the folks that were running it. So that was another reason for him being placed in having to post a bond of $1,000 and played into Fort Leavenworth. He continued to be an abolitionist, so did his wife. We continued to be pro-abolitionists. His sister was married to the chief of the Shawnees in Kansas, Pascal Fish, his sister Hester. So there was a lot of support among the Delaware, the Shawnee, and the Wyandots for abolitionist activities, both in Ohio and in Kansas. There was, because of the bond, Ebenezer had to start over his life again, having lost everything in Ohio. In fact, there's a family living in the house he built in Ohio to this day. It shows you how strong and nice of a structure. Unfortunately, the Wyandotte House Hotel is now in ruins, but you can see it from the overlook in Wyandotte, and we're trying to preserve and protect that abolitionist site. It did get commemorative status last year, and we're trying to get national heritage recognition. If you want to read a little bit more about the Wyandots and their movement from Ohio to Kansas, there is Mary Stockwell's Other Trail of Tears, and Catherine McGee LaBelle wrote Dispersed but Not Destroyed. She's a professor in Canada. That's in Chris, unless you have other
Good job, Holly.
information to provide. But I do think that there was a commonality between the Methodists, the Quakers, and the belief system of the Wyandots. I also believe, per Barbara Alice Mann, who is a Seneca from Ohio, who's written several books, that there would not have been the expansion of slavery, particularly in the South, but for the genocide and the removal of natives in the Northeast territory, including Ohio.
Her book's called George Washington's War on Native America. I highly recommend reading it as well. That's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Holly and Kristen, for coming and joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, we're really excited to have y'all here. So thank you. And of course, last but certainly not least, we have Debra Robinson. So Debra, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to request to unmute you, and I'm going to pass you the ball so that you can share your screen with your PowerPoint if you so choose. So if you just accept that request.
Okay, there's that.
Oh,
yeah. All right. I know, I'm so used to Zoom. And all I can say is God bless my students who had to adapt me fiddling around with all of these buttons like when we got slammed. All right. So share my screen. So what I'm going to do is welcome to my messy office. Welcome to my messy office. You can see bits and pieces of it. If I keep looking over here and down there, it's because my Yorkie poo just gets upset when he's not getting all the attention. So sometimes I have to just kind of, okay, I just have to look. Okay, so I'm going to start the slideshow. And let me see, let me get it to, all right. All right, so what I'm doing, I'm going to do something a little unorthodox because this is kind of the end of the presentation. Since this is the end, I'm the last person and I'm on last, and just in case, I'm going to start from the last and my last slide and work my way forward. So the last slide, and there's no photographs or anything, it's just basically text. So this would be the conclusion, okay, in terms of looking at interconnections among the Zanes, Wyandots, and Whetsels. You know, you can see how these families in the tribe were complicit in facilitating fugitives' escape from bondage as they seek freedom on the Underground Railroad. All right, further research that is needed that I need to do, or somebody else can pick it up, is I'm looking for documentation of business dealings between the Wyandots and Whetsels. Okay, and the supply of food and bricks. We'll get to that. Note, because I want to make sure I get this plug in, most of the sites in Seneca, Wyandot, and Logan County are still rural. Those sites are still there. In particular, my research area, the Solomon Day Farm, is part of the city park run by the city of Bellefontaine. And the foundations of Solomon Day, who was an Underground Railroad station master, according to Siebert. The foundations of the house and the spring house are still there. And at last check, the barn is still there. Also, we have an 1842 day cemetery, which is extant, and it's cared for by Jefferson Township, as in Zanesfield, as in Zanesfield. All right, also up in Seneca County, the Whetsel property is still a functioning farm up in Seneca County. And the owners are like the descendants of the family that bought the farm from the Whetsel. So it's been basically not many change of hands. Now, this is the dots. The title of my presentation was Connecting Dots. And so what I have on the screen are boxes with names inside the boxes of how I just started connecting dots. And the main dot is NZ McCulloch. And oh my goodness gracious, I spelled it wrong, but I'm not going to come out of it. I'll catch it later. All right, and you'll notice the dots started, the first dot was in Chester Hill, Ohio with Quakers. Okay, the next one was Solomon Day, who comes from Southampton, Virginia. It's also of fame because that's where the Notaways were, and that's also the home of Nat Turner. Okay, so researching Solomon Day led to NZ McCulloch, and I was like, who is this person? Oh, they spelled the name wrong. Who is this NZ McCulloch? And then that was what led me into the connection between Zanes and Wyandots, and it goes in two different directions. The bottom is Ebenezer, Jonathan, and William McCulloch, which is spelled correctly. okay, and Zane's Trace. And on the top part of the Wyandots are Isaac, Myra, and Tarhe. And then that leads over to the Wyandot Reservation and Negro Town, right, which connects to Daniel and Felix Whetsels, who were free people of color. They were farmers, they were prosperous farmers and brickmakers. And then, of course, that leads back down to Solomon Day and the Nottaways because the Whetsels married into the Days. This is kind of cute. If you look at, okay, so what it is that I have this like kind of semi-organizational chart, which I couldn't resist because this is my research baby picture that has to be almost 20 years old. And basically what it's showing are the family relationships with this community of free people of color who were Underground Railroad station masters. And it extends from, it's going up a line from Champaign to Logan to Hardin, also Wyandotte and Seneca County. And this is where these people were settled. And so I'm just going to read the text on the top because here I have the scratchings. I have the name and then I have the year in which they came to Ohio. For example, Henry Newsom came in 1806, but that's up 1806. Over on the right-hand side, William Barnhill came in 1812. And the Daniel came up in 1820, 1822. And Peter Bird, I'm not real sure. So anyway, just to real quickly go over this, Henry Newsom, the first colored credited to be the first colored Senate, the first, and I'm sorry, I teach at a tribal college. I teach on the Navajo Nation, and I am doing my darndest not to use words like settlers, pioneers, first families, and those kind of things, because I have changed. My perspective has changed dramatically. Anyway, so Henry Newsom comes up in 1806 with Mormons in Logan County, and they're Quakers in Logan County. His daughter Dorothy marries Peter Bird, Champaign County, big, major money farmer, who's also reputedly, not just reputedly, but one of the more famous Underground Railroad station conductors. And then Henry Newsom's daughter Lavinia marries Felix Whetsel, who is the son of Daniel, Seneca County. And of course, Felix's son Abram marries Elizabeth, who is a day daughter down in Logan County. Now, okay, all right. I'll tell you what, guys. I'm going to go back and start from the beginning because I wanted to make sure. Okay. All right. So my name is Debra Robinson. I am English faculty. I teach freshman composition classes, basic composition and the research class at Diné College, which is the first tribally controlled college in the United States. And I live in Saley, Arizona. One introduction I wanted to make, a point I needed to make was that my area of research are the free people of color communities who came to Ohio early on. All right. And most of whom had not been enslaved in the South. And basically they were seeking freedom, okay, to pursue the dream of owning land, raising their families and educating their children without fear, worshiping as they pleased and burying their dead with dignity. The legacy they left behind is one of thrift, industry, quiet achievement, and discreet activism. A lot of the names that I'm talking about now they're not known, they're not big names. Nobody's ever heard of them outside of our family reunions. All right, they were participants on the Underground Railroad, but they did not talk or brag about it. As one of the elders at one of the family reunions said, they couldn't. If they said anything, they could lose their farms. So we don't have an oral tradition of Underground Railroad. Famous abolitionists or crusaders, they were not, except for Felix Whetsel, who was part of the Colored Convention in 1850 in Ohio. Nor were they at the forefront in the fight to abolish slavery. Outside of family reunions, no one would know their names, but they assisted fugitives fleeing from bondage in the South. All All right. Now, in the early, and I know, okay, just to review again, I know we've heard this over and over again, but just to review, in the early days of statehood in the northeastern and northwestern sections of Ohio, there were Quaker communities that believed in cooperation, tolerance, assistance, and respect among neighbors. Be those neighbors Black farmers who came up in the South or Native American groups that were already present. Okay, Quakers were heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm specifically talking about the Route 68, Route 72 corridor, which ran from the Ohio River up to Lake Erie. The less obvious participants included these free people of color, the Native communities, white and mixed race communities. And, a lot of times there's no direct evidence unless we get people to go out and do archaeological digs to come up with hard evidence. You basically get to these connections by connecting dots, geographical, social, business, and family networks. Just before there was social media, there were social networks. There were churches, schools, newspaper, marketplaces, and family gatherings. Okay, so again, there's no direct evidence, but what we're doing is connecting dots. Now, to go back to the Siebert map, if you look, you have Zane's Trace, which started about 1800. And notice it goes from like Wheeling, the Zanesville area, and it cuts across and it comes all the way down to Mansfield. And and if you notice, notice right in the middle, you will see like a yellow dot. I'm sorry, I didn't circle it. But Lancaster, Ohio, which was wasn't that like the summer camp for Tarhay? Wyandots summer camp. There you go. All right. And at the same time, through Zane's Trace, you have these principal rivers running up, coming, feeding into the Ohio River. And of course, there were concessions. There were concessions along these rivers, which were controlled by Zane, McCulloch, and some of these other people. The other thing is on the left, you see like in pencil mark on this Underground Railroad route map, you see that Route 6872 corridor that goes from the Ohio River all the way up to Lake Erie. And notice that's where you get all of the counties. And you'll notice it's like that's where a lot of the free people of color who were prosperous farmers were settled along those counties, especially in the middle, going up. Now, what I have here is an atlas. Okay, this is taken from an atlas, with all of the different counties from Ohio. And if you notice, what I did was, so it's got blocks with all of the different counties from Ohio in it. And I penciled, I kind of colored in the map, which shows, and all of these maps include free people of color communities. And notice when you get to the top, you've got Wyandot County and you have Seneca County. Okay, over to the right, you have Columbiana County, and Stark County, which that'll come in a minute. Oops. All right, now, so what I did was, if you notice here, you've got Wyandotte and you've got Seneca. Of course, they're named for the Seneca Reservation and the Wyandotte Reservation. And I circled where you have McCutcheonville. That if you look closely, part of McCutcheonville feeds into Seneca County, like a little triangle shape. Is in Seneca County, and to the right of that, just outside of McCutcheonville, is where Daniel and Felix Whetsel had their farm. So it's right outside of there. And so those of you who are familiar with it, there's Upper Sandusky, right? There's McCutcheonville, and then within that circle, you would have the Whetsel family. Okay, now here's a 10-minute tour of how I connected the dots. I was doing this photo, okay, and on this particular slide, I just listed, it's just a list of actions that I took and connections. So I was in Chester Hill, Ohio, doing a photo shoot of what they call the slave caves, where they hid fugitives at night. Chester Hill, Ohio is a Quaker town. I was doing research, and I was reading Mysteries of the Underground Railroad, and just for a hoot, just for a kick, I decided to, go to the appendix and look up the station masters and station conductors. And lo and behold, what I saw was for Logan County, Solomon and John Day, who are my third and second great grandfathers, and Seneca County, the Whetsel family, who are my fourth and third great grandfathers. All right, so so Solomon Day was in Stark County in 1823. He moves to Logan County in 1839. So why? Why? Because there was a wave of folks coming up from Southampton, Virginia, and Northampton, North Carolina, just before and after the Nat Turner Rebellion, including the artist families. Solomon's first wife was an artist. Okay, they were both from Cross Keys, Virginia, as in Nat Turner land. And of course, new arrivals had to submit their free papers to the court. The court clerk, whose name appeared on most of the certificates, was N.Z. McCulloch. And I'm like, who is N.Z. McCulloch? There's got to be a connection. Why would this particular clerk be signing these certificates of freedom? And how did people in Southampton and Northampton know to send these people up to Logan County? All right, so here we go. William McCulloch, Ebenezer Zane, Zane's Trace, Zane's Bill. All right, so you also have Jonathan Zane, and I can't say that. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name on the slide, but he was Wyandotte, of course. And then, so you have a relationship with the brothers, Ebenezer, Jonathan, and Isaac. So Ebenezer, Jonathan, and Isaac were brother-in-laws to William McCulloch, who married Nancy Zane, thus the initials Noah Zane McCulloch. Okay, and years later, he becomes known in the history books in Logan County as the illustrious Judge N.Z. McCulloch. And I always wonder when I'm up in Logan County, do they know he's part Wyandotte? Anyway, so Nancy was Isaac Zane's daughter. The clerk N.Z. McCulloch, who signed the certificates of freedom in Logan County, was part Wyandotte. His grandfather Isaac had married Myra, Tarhe's daughter. Now, Isaac and Jonathan had been kidnapped by the Wyandots as boys. Jonathan was ransomed. Isaac stays home, goes home, he stays. He goes home back to Virginia. And by the way, he was in the House of Burgess when he was in Virginia. So that's kind of cool. And when he is of age, in the language of, 18th and 19th century historians, with a longing in his heart, he returns and marries Myra. Okay, and Tarhe gives them a tract of land, which becomes Zanesfield, Logan County, which is near Quaker Settlement, which is near where Solomon Day had his farm. So they're like these little Underground Railroad connections there. And the other little thing in my readings, I kept coming across, like, the United States government gave him this land after he petitioned Congress. But basically, I have the documentation where Isaac Zane petitioned 3 times to Congress to keep that land. So that land was given to him by Tarhe. It wasn't given to him by the U.S. government, and he had to petition to keep it. So now the next slide. Okay, if you look at it here, okay, this is a Route 68 72 corridor kind, all right. And so what I did was just putting little circles and little dots, because so this is we're still working with the Wyandots and the Zanes. So Lancaster, Ohio was Tarhe's summer camp. And this is part of Zane's Trace. And there had to have been a ferry concession there. And on that ferry concession, they had to have been complicit of folks making their way north. The same thing in Zanesville, because you got Ebenezer and you also have William McCulloch. And then, of course, you have Zanesfield, and it's kind of a little hard to see that on the map it's got the Quaker Settlement, which is New Jerusalem. All right. And it's like, if you haven't been there, you really should go visit Zanesfield and this whole area. It's it's beautiful land. It is so beautiful there. And there's a Quaker settlement, which is called New Jerusalem. And just up the road to the left is where Solomon Day had his farm. All right. And then, of course, as we keep going, you're going to go through the Wyandot Reservation. And, of course, you're going to go through the Wyandot Reservation. So basically, the connection, once you get to Wyandot and Seneca counties, are Wyandot, the Wyandot Reserve, Negro Town, and the Whetsel family. Yeah, and the Whetsels were independent. The Whetsels came up from Pike County in 1817. I think I've got that. All right, so Tarhay connects to the Wyandot Reservation. Wyandots are bordering with Seneca County. On the Wyandot Reservation, there's the colored people in Negro Town around Timochi Township, which is more or less 3 to 5 miles south of McCutcheonville, which the Whetsels were 3 or 4 or 5 miles east of McCutcheonville, and they were in McCutcheonville before McCutcheon. Yes. All right. Anyway, but I'm not. Anyway, so the Whetsels, Don and his son Felix, they arrived. Okay, we have the land records for 1822. Okay, they're from Rockingham, Virginia, via Kentucky, and then Pike County. They're in Kentucky, and we think with the white Whetsel, we're not sure what that relationship was, if it was like an ownership kind of relationship, but somehow or another they went from Kentucky, and then they went to Pike County in 1817, and then they went up to, they bought the land and settled, I don't want to say that word. They, bought their land and started and established themselves in Seneca County. There was a church and a schoolhouse on their land. They were prosperous farmers, and they had a successful brick making operation. The social networks for communications, whether they were open or clandestine, were operative among white, Black, and Native communities and the Whetsel family. They got along with everybody in the area, according to the obituary for Felix Whetsel. Okay, they are on the Siebert list as Underground Railroad Station Masters. And like the marriage connections between the Wyandots and the Zanes, the Whetsels intermarried with the free people of color community that connected even more Underground Railroad dots. Okay, those are the Whetsels that stayed within the community. Okay, there were other Whetsels that married outside the community, but we won't go there. And so that's why, I came up with this, my baby picture, my little research baby picture, because you can see Daniel Whetsel and Felix Whetsel, right? And going down to Lavinia on the one side, and then, through his grandson Abram going down to the Day family on the other side. And somehow or another, Henry Newsom is in the background of all of this. And okay, and then we're back to the dots. So basically, I started off with Chester Hill, Ohio. I knew the family had been in Ohio pre-Civil War, and I used to actually think the family came up on the Underground Railroad. Oh yeah, we came up in the Underground Railroad. And then I found out they were participants and that they were prosperous farmers. So from Chester Hill, I went to Solomon Day. Solomon Day, looking at that register of other people in Logan County, I stumbled on N.Z. McCulloch, and I promise you I will change that. In fact, never mind. Okay. N.Z. McCulloch. And the other thing is that it's not covered in this presentation, but N.Z. McCulloch had to have had connections in Southampton and Northampton, in Virginia and North Carolina, in those sections. There was a network going where they knew where to send people. And of course, Noah Zane is connected to the Wyandots. And of course, these guys, and you can see going down, I already went over it, Ebenezer, Jonathan, and William. Okay. And also the Wyandot guide that was with them, whose name I can't pronounce and I refuse to massacre. And then coming up, you've got Isaac, Mayer, and Tarhay. And then you come over here and you got the existence of Negro Town, on the Wyandot Reservation. And then it goes to, my arrows are going the wrong way, never mind. And it goes to Daniel and Felix, who are farmers and brick makers. And of course, it comes back down to Solomon Day. So the dot there was here. And then, know if I really need to repeat this. Maybe I'll do it in 30 seconds. But there are interconnections between the Zanes, the Wyandots, and the Whetsels. Okay, and these families and the tribe, they were complicit in facilitating fugitives escaping from bondage as they, sought freedom on the Underground Railroad. All right, like I said before, I'm looking for documentation of business dealings between the Wyandots and the Whetsels. There must have been, because when I was doing when I was with local researchers, they were claiming that a lot of the brick in McCutcheonville was basically Whetsel brick. And here we go from the house they tore down in 2001. I didn't even know the house existed. If you can see that, my little picture window, here's the ancestral brick. Okay, here's a Whetsel brick. Can you see it? Kind of. Okay. Thank you. Thumbs up. There's the ancestral brick. And I sold them off at the family reunion to raise scholarship money. And my other plea is that these sites in Seneca, Wyandot, and Logan, they're still rural. They haven't been paved over. They haven't put up shopping centers, put up factories or farm factories. And so we still have to do the day farm, the day farm. With the day farm in Bell Fountain, when it was a Girl Scout camp, My Era was the name of the camp. The manager put that section of what is now the city park is on land easement. They cannot develop that land. So that land is there. And the day cemetery is there. And also, we're also researching, we think we have, because this also has mournings, and we think Britton Mourning Jr. was in the Civil War, so we think we have a Civil War vet. And the Whetsel property is still functioning farm up in Seneca County. And when I was up there, years ago, before I moved out here, when I was visiting with the farming family, they kept talking about when they plow in the spring, they're always turning up pieces of brick. So anyway, and down below is my email, drobinson@dinécollege.edu, if you want to get a hold of me. And that's it. You can.
All good.
Oh, I got to. Do I take it off? Do I take it off?
Up at the top, you should see like an orange box. If you hover over that on the left-hand side, it should let you just stop sharing. You should be good.
Okay, you're sharing. Oh, I see it. All right. I'm so programmed to the orange.
All good.
Zoom box.
There we go.
There we go.
All right. Thank you all for coming and joining us today. I do realize that we went a little bit over time. I haven't seen any questions so far in the chat. If you do have a question for our presenters, we're going to hang out for a little bit longer. So you're welcome to drop a question in that chat box. You can get there on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. This recording will be made available online. It will be on the Network to Freedom website under Past Professional Development. With that said, thank you all for joining us today. Presenters, if you can hang on for just another few minutes, just in case we get any last-minute questions, and we'll go from there. Thank you guys so much, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day and a lovely Thanksgiving weekend.